They brought her into the Supreme Court to put her in her place. But by the end of the session, even Justice Roberts had to stop and reconsider who was really holding the power. They weren't expecting her to speak. Not really. Not in a room like that. The Supreme Court chamber in Washington, D.C. was packed tighter than usual. Not just legal scholars and journalists, but White House correspondents, cable anchors, and even a few foreign observers. Cameras were barred, as always, but everyone knew today's hearing would spill out into every news cycle within hours. It was a public clarification session, rare but not unheard of, meant to address the limits of executive privilege when it collided with the public's right to transparency, a tangle of constitutional threads. But what drew headlines wasn't the topic. It was the person they'd called to speak. Karoline Leavitt, 30 years old, White House press secretary, sharp tongue, faster brain, known for her fierce media briefings and unapologetic tone. Some saw her as the administration's dagger in a tailored suit. Others dismissed her as just another loud partisan. But today she stood in a room that didn't care about spin. She sat quietly in the second row, expression unreadable. Navy blazer, not a hair out of place. Her folder rested on her lap, closed. No aides, no screen, just her. "Why is she here?" a woman whispered behind her hand, leaning toward a colleague from the Baltimore Sun. "Roberts invited her," the man murmured. "Said she's been speaking on behalf of the executive on legal matters. Wants clarification." It didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like bait. At the front of the room, Chief Justice John Roberts adjusted his glasses and signaled for the session to begin. The other justices sat upright, alert but neutral. Roberts scanned the room and then settled his eyes on Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, his tone measured, his posture impeccable. "Since you have been, as you put it, defending the administration's transparency record in matters of national concern, perhaps you can clarify to this court your understanding of how that transparency balances against executive privilege in cases involving national security and press access." There it was. Not a question, a challenge. A few heads turned. Some journalists instinctively scribbled in their notepads. The tension wasn't loud, but it was there, like when someone drops a glass in a quiet room and no one moves. Karoline's fingers brushed the folder on her lap. She didn't open it. She stood up. "Thank you, Chief Justice," she said. Her voice carried evenly across the chamber. "To begin, I'd like to clarify that my role, while not legal in title, has required me to interpret and communicate legal positions, often under intense public scrutiny." She took a beat, looking around the room. Her gaze didn't falter. "But I'll respond to your question directly," she added, "because I do believe the public deserves clarity, not just from the press, but from the administration as well." Roberts gave nothing away. His eyes followed her movements like a chess player watching a rookie make their first move. Karoline's mind was sharp, but she wasn't naive. This wasn't a conversation. This was theater, and she was standing on the wrong side of the curtain. She knew every word she said would be picked apart, but she also knew that sometimes the room you fear the most is the one where you prove you belong. Outside, beyond the court's marble columns, protesters gathered with signs and chants that had nothing to do with her directly. Inside, silence ruled. Karoline inhaled once, slow, intentional, and locked eyes with Roberts. "The line between national interest and national security is often blurry," she began. "But legal precedent, even in the most contentious cases, has emphasized that the burden of secrecy lies with the government, not the press, and not the public." But Roberts wasn't done testing her, and what came next would force Karoline to reach deeper than scripted answers. Chief Justice Roberts shifted slightly in his seat, lifting a sheet of paper from the bench in front of him. His expression hadn't changed, but the air around him had. He'd heard her opener, articulate, poised, but now it was time to tighten the screws. "You referenced New York Times Company v. United States, Ms. Leavitt," he said, tone still calm, but his words carried weight. "A case concerning prior restraint in the publication of classified documents. Would you say your administration's recent refusal to release internal communications concerning intelligence briefings aligns with the ruling in that case?" It wasn't a softball, it was layered, dangerous. If she said yes, she risked suggesting that her administration was undermining press freedom. If she said no, she could be seen as contradicting the White House. Karoline didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer to the podium, closer to the line she hadn't expected to walk today. I would say, she began carefully, that each administration faces its own version of that tension. What the court ruled in that case was that the government bears the burden of proof in demonstrating real harm, not hypothetical, not political. She glanced at the paper in Roberts' hand. And in the Pentagon Papers case, that bar wasn't met. Justice Myers, one of the newer voices on the bench, interjected, "So are you saying your administration's position is unconstitutional?" There was a soft stir in the room, the kind that happens when someone smells blood. One wrong word, and headlines would write themselves. But Karoline didn't backpedal. She didn't even blink. "I'm saying that we're weighing national interest against genuine, provable security risks. And I'm saying we're open to being challenged when we cross a line," she replied. "That's what transparency looks like. It means being accountable, even when it's inconvenient." A pause. Justice Morales leaned toward Roberts slightly, whispering something behind the bench. The chief gave a slow exhale, not exasperated, not amused, just alert. Roberts lowered the sheet. "Let's speak plainly. You're a communications officer. You weren't elected, you weren't confirmed, and yet you've spoken to the press with legal authority. Do you believe your role entitles you to interpret constitutional law?" There it was. The real question, not about precedent, not about privilege, about legitimacy, about who gets to speak and who gets to be taken seriously. Karoline turned fully to face the bench. The room felt narrower now, smaller. "No," she said, "but I believe my role requires me to understand it, because when the public turns on the television and sees me at that podium, they expect more than just a script. They expect answers that are rooted in truth, in law, in history, and in the reality they're living." There was no grandstanding in her voice, no moral high ground, just the kind of clarity that left little room for rebuttal. Roberts didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked to his right. Justice Warren was studying Karoline now, not skeptically, but closely, like someone rereading a paragraph they'd misjudged the first time. Meanwhile, seated behind the barrier, a young journalist for the Des Moines Register typed furiously, whispering to her neighbor, "She's flipping the room. I swear she is." And in a hallway outside the chamber, a low-level staffer from the Department of Justice sent a quiet text to his supervisor. "Leavitt's not just holding her own, she's on fire." But Karoline wasn't celebrating. She hadn't come for praise. She came to make a point that couldn't be ignored. But Roberts had one more card to play, and this time he wasn't going to let her set the pace. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward, ever so slightly. His eyes didn't leave Karoline. "Let's say, for the sake of argument," he said, "that the administration's decision to withhold certain classified documents from the press does violate the precedent you just cited. Would you consider that a failure of constitutional duty? And if so, do you bear any responsibility as the person communicating that policy?" No one moved. It wasn't just a legal question. It was personal, deliberately. Roberts had just threaded her into the needle. Most would have shifted, dodged, referred it back to legal counsel. Karoline stepped forward once more. She didn't grab the microphone. She didn't flip through notes. She just spoke. "I've learned something important in this job," she said. "The messenger doesn't get to hide behind the message. So yes, if the administration crosses a constitutional line, then I have to live with the fact that I stood behind that podium and defended it. And if I can't stand by what I say, I shouldn't be standing there at all." That silenced even the shuffling notepads. But she didn't stop there. "I also think there's something dangerous happening," she added, voice steady. "We've reached a point where every decision gets run through a partisan lens before it's even understood. The media accuses the government of secrecy. The government accuses the media of irresponsibility. And in the middle, the public feels lied to by both." Justice Warren spoke this time. "So what's your solution, Ms. Leavitt? Transparency at any cost?" "No," she said. "Transparency with context. You can't dump classified briefings onto a press room floor and call it honesty, but you also can't block access and then pretend nothing is wrong. She paused just long enough for her words to settle. There's a balance, and when that balance is tested, the people in charge need to have more than just clearance. They need conscience. A murmur passed through the rows of observers, subtle, but it was there. Robert crossed his hands. And yet you're not a lawyer. What qualifies you to draw these lines? Karoline held his gaze. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I'm not a lawyer, she said, but I've read every major ruling involving press freedom in the last 50 years. I've studied the language of Brandsburg, Pentagon Papers, Bartnicki, and Zerker. Not to play lawyer, but because my job doesn't allow ignorance. She took one step closer to the bench, still within her space, but now fully visible to each justice. You know what else I've read? She continued. Statements from people like Josh Earnest, Dana Perino, Ari Fleischer, press secretaries who faced moments where the legal, the ethical, and the public interest didn't align. They didn't run. They didn't blame others. They stood there and answered, because silence is not neutral. She glanced briefly toward the gallery, where a few reporters had started jotting notes again. Then back to Roberts. I might not hold a law degree, she said, but I respect what this court represents. And I respect the people who will take my words today and dissect every syllable. That's the price of public trust, and I'm willing to pay it. For the first time, Roberts sat back, not defeated, but paused. Justice Myers raised an eyebrow. You prepared for this? Karoline half smiled, the first hint of ease on her face. I didn't know what questions were coming, but I knew what mattered. Outside, the wind picked up across First Street. A protester with a hand-painted sign called her a propagandist. Another, right next to him, called her a hero. Neither of them were entirely right or entirely wrong. But inside that courtroom, for the first time, Karoline Leavitt was being judged for her answers, not her title. The justices weren't reacting the way anyone expected. Not the press, not the staffers in the back row, and certainly not the administration's critics who'd shown up hoping to watch Karoline stumble. Instead of brushing her off, they were leaning in, not physically, but mentally. The kinds of questions they were asking had changed. They weren't rhetorical traps anymore. They were real inquiries, the kind you only throw at someone when you think they might have something worth hearing. Justice Warren tapped his pen against the wood in front of him. You mentioned the case of Zercher versus Stanford Daily, he said. Do you believe that ruling, allowing police to search a newsroom, has any relevance to the administration's current handling of internal communications? Karoline nodded slightly, then answered, I do. That case drew a line between criminal investigation and freedom of the press. It raised the question, can the press be treated like any other citizen under the law, or does the First Amendment afford extra protection in cases of news gathering? She paused. Our administration has faced similar lines. Do you turn over internal briefings because the press demands it, or because it's legally required? The principle is the same. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And just because something's secret doesn't mean it's sacred. Justice Morales leaned back, tapping his finger once on his notebook. There was something calm in the room now, not relaxed, but focused. The temperature had dropped a few degrees. The tension wasn't gone, but it had changed form. Karoline looked toward Roberts again. When we talk about press access, we're not just talking about journalists in a room. We're talking about every person watching at home who doesn't understand why their government speaks in half-truths. Roberts tilted his head slightly. And you believe you're closing that gap? I'm trying to, she said. That's the job, right? Not just to communicate, but to translate. The law is complicated, the world is messy, but people still deserve to know what's being done in their name. Silence again. But it wasn't awkward, it was thoughtful. Somewhere behind Karoline, a court clerk looked up from their notes, almost surprised by how quiet the room had become. Back at the White House press room, a young deputy named Erica was watching the live transcript stream on her laptop. She scrolled back, rereading Karoline's words. Then she reached for her phone and texted a group thread labeled Media Prep. She's killing it. This might change everything. Meanwhile, in a cafe in Pittsburgh, an older man in a Union jacket stared at the breaking news crawl across a muted TV. He didn't know much about Karoline Leavitt, and he didn't care much for politics. But something about her answer, about conscience over clearance, made him nod quietly to himself and sip his coffee. The story was moving now, not just inside the court, but out in the country. And Karoline? She felt it too. She stood still, shoulders level, voice steady. She had more to say, but she also understood that sometimes saying less left more impact. The moment had shifted. Justice Warren tapped his pen again. "One last question, Mrs. Leavitt," he said. "Do you see yourself as a legal interpreter for the administration?" Karoline thought carefully before answering. "No, Justice. I see myself as a conduit. My job isn't to redefine the law. It's to explain the administration's decisions in a way people can understand, and to speak plainly when we're wrong, or when we're being questioned, like today." And with that, she took a step back. No drama, no mic drop, just quiet conviction. But the session wasn't over, and Robert still had one more angle he intended to press. There was a stillness in the room that didn't match the stakes. A Supreme Court clarification session wasn't supposed to feel this personal, but somehow it did. Chief Justice Roberts adjusted the documents in front of him, but didn't look down. His expression was harder to read now. Not smug, not skeptical, focused. "I appreciate your clarity, Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice cool but more even than before. "One final question." Karoline steadied herself. Her heels felt like anchors against the polished floor. The weight of everything she'd said, every citation, every word crafted not just for the bench, but for the millions beyond it, pressed down now. Roberts continued, "If the current administration were found to have withheld documents unjustifiably under executive privilege, would you publicly admit that error from the press podium?" There was no twist this time, no legal sleight of hand, just a yes or no question designed to corner her into a soundbite. She took a breath. Yes, no hesitation, no elaboration. But Roberts raised a brow. "Even if it contradicted the legal advice you were given?" "Yes," she said again. "Because the truth doesn't change based on the credentials of the person who speaks it. If we get it wrong, the public deserves to hear it from me directly." There it was, the end of the exchange. Karoline stepped back from the podium as the justices gave their final remarks. Nothing dramatic, no verdicts, no dismissals. This wasn't a trial, it was a moment, and the moment had spoken. By the time she exited through the side corridor, the buzz outside was starting. Reporters were filing back to their newsrooms, voices overlapping as they called in quotes and hot takes. Some were still unsure what they'd just witnessed. Others already knew. In the press car waiting near Maryland Avenue, Karoline sank into the back seat, her breath slow and steady. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply looked out the window. Inside the Supreme Court building, a law clerk named Shauna turned to her supervisor and said, "I thought she was just going to give us fluff. Honestly, she came ready." Cable networks lit up within the hour. Panelists on morning shows debated her tone, her preparation, her willingness to admit potential fault, a rarity in that role. One legal analyst on a Phoenix radio station said, "She wasn't defending herself. She was defending the truth." That night, a segment aired on a regional news affiliate in Fort Wayne. The anchor closed it with, "For the first time in a long time, the press secretary didn't sound like a gatekeeper. She sounded like someone who understands how high the stakes really are." But Karoline wasn't watching. She was back at her desk, reviewing transcripts and notes from the week. A knock on her office door broke the silence. It was Erica, her young deputy. "Can I ask you something?" Erica said. Karoline looked up. "Sure. How'd you stay calm in there? I mean, that was the Supreme Court." Karoline leaned back in her chair, thinking for a beat. "I've been underestimated my whole life," she said. "When you get used to that, you stop chasing approval. And you start chasing accuracy." Erica nodded, taking that in. Karoline added, "If I had panicked, they would have been right about me, so I didn't." That was it. No magic, no secret playbook, just preparation and resolve. But there was still one thing left to say, not to the court, but to the people who'd been watching all along. The next morning came fast. Fog clung low across parts of the Potomac, and D.C. hadn't quite woken up. But the White House press room was already full. Phones buzzed, laptops clicked, cameras were being positioned, cords taped down, coffee consumed like water. Karoline stepped in through the side door just before 8:00 a.m. No fanfare, no smile. She walked up to the podium like it was any other Thursday. But nothing about this day was normal. Every reporter in that room had watched her stand her ground before the highest court in the country less than 24 hours earlier. And now they wanted more. "Good morning," she said, adjusting the mic slightly. "We'll get to your questions in a moment, but I'd like to say something first." No paper in her hand, no script. "When I was invited to speak in front of the court, I knew what it looked like. A press secretary, young, unelected, uncredentialed, walking into a room built for scholars and judges. But I showed up because the people who elected this administration expect their government to explain itself. Clearly, directly." She scanned the crowd. "I didn't go to that courtroom to defend a mistake or spin a narrative. I went because the public deserves someone willing to show up when it's hard, and to answer, even when the answer might sting." A few reporters shifted in their seats. Some scribbled, some just listened. Karoline continued, "You don't have to like me. You don't have to agree with this administration. But if you're looking for someone who hides behind legal counsel, you've got the wrong podium." From the back, an older journalist raised a hand. "Were you coached before the hearing?" "No," she said plainly. "I reviewed court rulings and did my own prep. The legal team offered background, but no talking points. The words were mine." Another question came in, this time from a younger reporter. "Do you think Chief Justice Roberts was trying to embarrass you?" Karoline hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because this one mattered. "I think he was doing his job," she said, "and I think I was doing mine." And somehow that landed harder than any punch. Later that afternoon, Karoline walked the hall toward her office, heels tapping rhythmically against the tile. Erica caught up to her, slightly out of breath, holding a notepad. "You have an interview request from a campus news outlet in Kansas. They want to talk about women in government roles, especially the ones no one expects us to handle." Karoline smiled for the first time all day. "Tell them yes." Erica blinked. "Really? You're taking that one?" "They're the ones who actually get it," Karoline said. "It's not about power, it's about permission. And too many people still think they need someone else to give them the right to speak." They reached Karoline's office, and before stepping in, she paused. "You ever been talked over in a meeting?" she asked. Erica gave a short laugh. "Once a week." Karoline looked her in the eye. "Next time, keep talking. The ones who get loud first aren't always the ones worth listening to." That line would later go viral. Not from a speech, not from a press conference. Just a hallway chat, caught on a staffer's phone, shared quietly, then suddenly, everywhere. The moment became more than just a defense of her administration's position. It became a message. A quiet, grounded reminder that being underestimated isn't a disadvantage unless you believe it is. And that truth, that's what stuck with people. But there was still one final thing Karoline wanted the country to remember. Not just about her, but about all of them. It wasn't the headlines that mattered most to Karoline, not the pundits on TV, not the hashtags, not even the praise from people who had written her off a year ago. What mattered was what came after. 3 days after the hearing, Karoline received a handwritten letter. No return address. Just a folded envelope slipped into the morning White House mail delivery. The handwriting was shaky, the ink budged in parts. But the words were clear. "My granddaughter saw you on the news. She asked me why a judge tried to embarrass someone like you. I told her, sometimes people test you not because they expect you to fail, but because they can't imagine you succeeding. You changed how she sees herself. Thank you for standing there." Karoline read it twice. She didn't cry, but she sat still for a long time. Later that afternoon, she visited a high school in Ohio where a group of students had requested a visit weeks earlier. Originally, it was supposed to be about media and messaging, but the principal greeted her at the front office with a new topic. They want to talk about courage. Inside a crowded classroom, a boy in the front row asked, Weren't you scared? Caroline smiled. Yes, she said, but I was more scared of letting someone else define me. Another student raised her hand. What if they had laughed at you? Then I would have finished what I had to say anyway, Caroline replied, because the second you start speaking only to be liked, you stop saying anything that matters. No teleprompter, no suit, just Caroline in a gray cardigan, sleeves rolled to her elbows, telling the truth to kids who'd remember every word. That night, as she flew back to D.C., the plane cut through clouds above Indiana. She looked out the window, not searching for anything in particular, just thinking. She thought about the courtroom, about the silence when she answered without flinching, about the questions that pushed her and the ones that helped her grow. And she thought about what she wanted people to remember. Long after the segment faded, long after the moment was replaced by the next headline. It wasn't about being brilliant or perfect or polished. It was about being prepared and showing up, even when you're underestimated, even when the room wasn't built for you. It was about refusing to shrink. When the press briefing began the next morning, Caroline opened with a line that didn't come from a memo or a strategist. It came from that seat in the courtroom. The work we do here will outlive every one of us. The only question is what kind of record we want to leave behind. No one interrupted. No one tried to cut her off. And for once, the silence wasn't about doubt. It was about respect. We all have moments where the room feels too big, the questions too sharp, the judgment too loud. But what Karoline Leavitt showed, in front of the highest court in the land, is that preparation beats performance. Truth beats title. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is answer the question no one thinks you're qualified to handle. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, remember her story. And remember that the people who try to silence you often do it because deep down, they know your words carry weight. Speak anyway. Stand anyway. And if you found power in this story, subscribe to the channel, because more voices deserve to be heard.